Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, June 16th, 2025, and our friend Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you for inviting me. Hi to everybody.
Colonel, let's get started with what has happened in the Middle East. Israel attacked Iran, and in the initial hours, everybody was asking what's going on with Iran. And because there was no response from Iranian air defense system, nothing. And later on, we've learned that Israel has used the same tactics, the same tactic that they've used in against Russia in the attack on the nuclear bombers. They brought a lot of weapons, a lot of uh, jammers and drones in Iran to start with, and before they're attacking. And after the initial 5 to 6 hours, they haven't shown anything substantial to Iranian defense system because they retrieved what they've lost in the initial hours. And right now they're back. They're attacking Israel and they're attacking the missiles are hitting Tel Aviv and you name it, and all the cities in Israel, important cities, and Haifa, all of that. Your take on what has happened in the initial hours and what's going on right now with the missiles hitting Israel?
Well, from my point of view, when I say point of view, is from the fact that I have only limited information about what happened in the very first hours. It's very difficult to assess exactly what happened. We know that the Israelis brought some equipment, drones, and things like this within Iran in order to have something similar to what we have seen, as you rightly said, in Russia. Beyond this, to be honest, I am a little bit in the fog of war because there are different rumors or information regarding this first period. Some say, well, the Israeli came with jammers and things like this. I don't know. Some said, and that's probably true, by the way, that when the Iranian felt under attack, they cut or limited the access to internet in order to avoid a remote control system and things like this to work properly. And so there is probably a mixture of things that happened. But I think at this stage, we are a little bit in the speculations because there is no real information. What is sure is that for a while, we saw nothing at the very beginning, and probably on purpose, because when you especially when it comes to drone warfare, it's exactly what you see, for instance, in Ukraine, that the first attack is not designed to destroy your target, but to identify the target, meaning that when you make your first attack, you provoke a reaction, and this reaction shows exactly the location of your defense systems, and then you can attack those defense systems. So it's a two-phased type of attack. I don't know exactly what the Israeli had in mind in Iran, but we might have had something like this. And in order to prevent this two-stage attack to happen, the Iranians have delayed the activation of some systems in order to prevent that. But again, I have absolutely no idea of the details of what happened. What is sure is that what we have seen after that, after the, let's say, 6 or 7 hours, we have seen that the command and control structure of Iran was working perfectly, that the planning of the operations was carefully made. And as I think it's also very important, because probably what happened also within the command of the Iranian, it was to assess the scope of the attack in order to provide an adequate measure. We have discussed that when we talked about True Promise 1 and 2, that the Iranians are in fact condemned to choose their response very carefully. It has to be carefully adjusted to the threat Otherwise, they can provoke some kind of Western intervention, US, UK, you name it. And therefore, it has to be very well calibrated. But this calibration probably takes some time, even if we're talking about minutes, maybe some hours, but in order to provide exactly the adequate response to the attack. And what we have seen in the first hours, in the first wave of response of Iran, showed that they have calibrated the response carefully in order to respond almost exactly to what the Israeli have done. You know, they wanted. I mean, the Israelis have attacked mostly some aspect of the command structure and the nuclear infrastructure. Now, what we have seen from Iran, they responded in the very same way to attack the same kind of targets. So probably the command and control required this delay in order to provide the exact response. I don't know. This is just based on observation and just based on my level of information at this stage. I might be wrong, but I think that's how it started and how Iran didn't want to respond massively to an attack with the risk of creating the pretext for a massive US involvement, for instance. So that's my explanation. And we have seen that, in fact, at play last year. The Iranians are extremely careful and they're always on an edge, in fact. You know, you have to respond enough to make Israel to understand that they are crossing a red line. But at the same time, you cannot respond massively because that would create World War III or something like that. Therefore, it requires a very, very well calibrated issue. Another aspect probably in this process is that although Iran has reestablished good relations with its neighbors, including and especially Saudi Arabia, I'm not sure they are confident on the way these allies would respond in case of, let's say, a regional conflict. The ties between Saudi Arabia and the US, for instance, are extreme. I mean, they are historically very deep. And depending on the interest of these allies, the Iranians might be alone in the conflict. Therefore, they have to be very, very careful in order not to be isolated within the Middle East with all the other countries, because a lot of those governments, take Jordan, for instance, there is some kind of corruption here. I'm not saying the government is corrupt, but at large is a kind of corruption in the sense that these countries are completely enslaved by the US, and they don't have an independent foreign policy. And therefore, you have to be very careful with that. Another example is, for instance, Syria. You don't really know in which direction they will go in case of a regional conflict. So it makes things for Iran a little bit more difficult. Although Iran has gained a lot of sympathy, especially because Israel has also gathered a lot of antipathy in the world, and that has been transferred to Iran. So Iran has worldwide, I think, a great deal of sympathy and support, at least politically, but physically, operationally, on a theater of war that would be like Middle East, it's very hard to assess how supported Iran would be in the case of war. You know,
Do you
only Yemen, in fact, would be ready to support. The Houthis are the only ones that have demonstrated that they are ready to engage into a conflict, regardless of the cost, because they are fighting for principles, unlike any other Arab country in the Middle East.
Do you think that with this attack on Iran, they thought that with the decapitation, because in the initial hours, in even yesterday and the day before, Netanyahu and his administration, most of the people in Israel, officials, even even the former Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, they were sending a lot of message on social media. Netanyahu was putting out video messages to Iranian people. It's time for you to rise up and go against the government in Iran. It's time for so-called regime change in Iran. Somehow there's so much delusional when you look at the Iranian society. They don't understand the basics when it comes to Iranian society. They know how these are proud people, nationalists. I don't know if anybody knows in their in their part knows about the mindset in Iran. It's totally different from what they're advocating for.
Yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, the name of the operation is Rising Lion, and lion is a symbol of Iran. So this is the idea is to provoke some kind of interaction with Iran. Now, when you talk about the Iranian society, you probably talk about the society you know, which is in Tehran, in Qom, in all these cities, which are obviously Iranian and all that, and who belong to the Iranian history, if you allow me that. But if you look at what you see on social network, there's an appeal to all these uh, independentist movement in the south, in the north, the Mujahideen Halk, and all these movements who are there, probably dormant to some extent. I mean, the MEK, who used to be considered as a terrorist movement, even by the US, by the way, has been removed from the list of terrorist organizations in order to promote some kind of insurrection in Iran. So we have a couple of these movements around, especially at the borders of Iran, who do exist, and there has been several appeals to those movements to wake up and take arms against the government. So, yes, if you talk about this Iranian society, this is true. But at the same time, I think the message is not exclusively to the society you know and where you probably your family belong. It's probably addressing all these movements who are ready to provoke any kind of insurrection, who are widely supported by the West, widely armed, politically supported. I mean, the MEK has or had for a long time, and still has, by the way, its headquarters in Paris, for instance, and they are completely legal in Paris, although it's a terrorist movement, or it used to be a terrorist movement, and had terrorist activities in Iran. So these kind of movements might be wakened up by this kind of appeal and create some kind of, let's say, instability. Let's put it that way. I'm not saying they are in a position to create a regime change, but they're probably in a position to create some kind of instability within Iran. And this instability could lead somewhere. I don't know where. I'm not able to assess that. But this is a reality. You know, I used to write an encyclopedia of terrorist and violent organization in the world. It's about 1,500 pages book, which is an encyclopedia. And Iran has a lot of these movements. They are there. Balochistan and all that. You know them because you hear them, and when they have an action, you have an action from these guys, like a bombing or some killings and things like that. They are also instrumental in helping, for instance, when we have those actions against some scientists and things like this, we know that yes, of course, you can call that Mossad, and probably you have one or few guys of Mossad involved. But basically, they rely on those movements within Iran to perform terrorist activities with the blessing of the West. So yes, you're right, and there is a sense of that the Iranian society is not 100% under the the leadership, and I think wrongly. Also, because when we talk about Iran in the West, if you look on TV and things like that, or in Europe, for instance, when you talk about the situation in Iran, the people who come on TV are not those people coming from the society you know. They are always opponents, basically those who are based in our countries. These are precisely those members or representative of these subversive movements, we can say, in Iran. Therefore, our view of Iran is extremely distorted. So we may have a wrong understanding of the society. I think the majority of the population in Iran is behind the leadership that we have, that we know in Iran. I mean, I have some friends in the Iranian community, and I even had a friend of mine who, I mean, I don't want to go into the specifics because I don't want him to be identified. Um, but although it was absolutely clean in the sense, but these people are not. They told me, I was asking about the situation in Iran, and they gave me the same picture that what you tell me. That in essence, even if not everybody accept, for instance, when it comes to the scarf or things like this, like for women, there's a lot of women who don't like it, but it doesn't go beyond this at such. There is no questioning of the whole system, if you can put it that way. And I personally view based on what I have heard from people who are not in the opposition, and who and if I compare with those who are in the opposition and who appear in the media here, that in essence, by and large, the Iranian population is following its leadership. And what we have seen in the street in Iran since the strike of last Friday, we have seen a lot of people going in the streets and demonstrating against Israel. We have seen a lot of Hezbollah flags in the streets, showing that, in essence, not everybody might be totally in line with the government, but once the country is attacked, especially for no reason, that creates a sentiment of national unity, and that's exactly what you have. So I would say yes. We have to. I agree with you. The West doesn't understand the Iranian society. We tend to overplay the role of opposition. We tend to distort the view that it's a country that is basically living peacefully. We put emphasis on all the small details that don't work, but you could put exactly the finger on the same items in Europe, by the way. This is. But on the other hand, we have, if I were Iranian, but I'm sure they are aware of that. I'm not inventing the wheel here. We have to be careful about all these movements that live in the periphery of Iran, who are prone to be supported by clandestine forces, CIA and others, in order to create a chaos in the country and to create the condition for some kind of revolutionary mood and things like this. So there is a potential of destabilization that exists, And again, I have seen all the appeals in the past hours on social media, showing that obviously the West is counting on that. Um, on the other hand, I think that the core of the Iranian population is stable and it doesn't want to be destabilized. And they, above all, they don't want others to define what Iran should be. That's, I think, the core thing. But in essence, I agree with you that people don't understand the Iranian society.
Do you think that Israel has or had a plan? They knew what they were doing? Because it seems to me that they thought that with the initial hours of the attack on Iran, they can bring everything to an end. It would be a great blow. It would be somehow a, a great impact on the Iranian government, which they cannot retrieve from that, which they cannot come back from that and fight back Israel. Right now, after those attacks in the initial hours, they didn't attack that much Iran, and they're trying to do something within Iran, in Iran, with the drones, with these terrorist activities in Iran. But with the scale that Iran is attacking Israel, I don't know if Israel can sustain this sort of conflict, this sort of war of attrition. As we know, the United States is removing air defense systems from Ukraine to Israel, moving them from Ukraine to Israel. It doesn't seem that Israel had a long term plan for this attack.
Well, that's true. Well, this is always the weakness of the West at large, Israel in particular, and we have seen in Gaza, by the way. The weakness of the West is that it underestimates its enemies all the time. And that's why the West has been defeated in every war they have waged in the Middle East. They have been defeated in Iraq. They have been defeated in Afghanistan. They've been defeated everywhere. And in places where you cannot really say that they have been defeated, they didn't achieve any positive success. They didn't achieve, like Libya, for instance. Yes, they toppled and removed Gaddafi, but they didn't. They were not able to have something constructive in place after that. So, in essence, I would consider that as a failure. So it's everywhere the same thing. In Israel, this is with Gaza, it's exactly the same thing. By the way, Israel is the only country that managed to keep terrorism, or what they call terrorism, or resistance, for more than 80 years. That means that this country is totally unable to cope with the problem. And they always consider that the enemy is weak, is incompetent, and all that. And in fact, they are the incompetent ones because they are not able to assess the enemy as its right level. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, we have seen exactly the same thing with Ukraine and Russia, with Europe and Russia. And now we have the same thing with the Israel and Iran. But you have the same thing with Trump and China. Everything has backfired because this is the weakness. We are so used to be superior, to be the best, the biggest, the strongest, the most brutal, and all that, that we are not used to face an adversary which is a peer, which has the same level as we do, or we tend to consider them as inferior. We have developed in the last 2 centuries a kind of arrogance that tends to promote this idea that we are the only ones and the rest has to adapt. And today we have a different thing. I mean, today Iran has technology that Israel is not able to match. This proclaimed Iron Dome that would protect Israel and would be the kind of impenetrable armor around Israel is in fact ineffective. We have seen that against the Palestinian rockets. We have seen that with the True Promise 1, 2, and now 3. So there is a kind of arrogance that tends to overestimate our own capacities and capabilities and to underestimate others. And that's a little bit what happened. They felt that this demonstration of force, I mean, the initial strike would be sufficient to destabilize the country. And in fact, it didn't. And probably that explains also why during the first hours you had this very calm. I mean, we have seen in the past that the Iranians have never replied very quickly to the Israeli attack. Iranians have always taken their time to think about it, to develop a plan, to have a strategy, and to launch an attack that proved to be extremely effective and that the Israelis were not able to stop because not because of the technology, but because the way the attack or the strike was designed. And it's exactly what we have seen. We have seen at this time exactly the same pattern as what we have seen in True Promise 1 and 2, meaning that the Israelis have failed a third time in the same situation. You know, everybody makes mistakes, but only the stupid ones make it twice. So we are exactly in the situation, and the arrogance is probably the main problem of Israel. And we have seen that with the Houthis, we've seen that with the Palestinians. They never question themselves institutionally. I mean, because you have a couple of people, and if you look at the former chiefs of Mossad or Shabak, so the domestic intelligence, you have a lot of people who understand the problem and understand this inherent weakness of the Israeli culture. I would say even Jewish culture, in fact, which is an inherent weakness, and that led the Jewish people in history to its own problems, in fact, because what we see today is just the tip of the iceberg. But in the past, we have seen exactly the same pattern, but that had dramatic consequences. But we will not develop this. This is not the topic today. But in essence, we have this aspect of culture that prevents people of questioning their own ability to talk to others. And that's a reason why when you talk to when you talk about the crisis we have both in Palestine, in Lebanon, with all these crises around Israel, the common point is the total absence of diplomacy. Israel doesn't consider that talking to others might solve the problem. It's always a solution that comes out of the use of force, never out of the use of diplomacy. And there is no Israeli diplomacy per se. I mean, they probably make nice declaration at in the UN in New York, but that's it. You don't have a diplomatic activity that leads to concrete result and concrete to let's say a peaceful environment for Israel. We have discussed that many times. This is not just a matter of policy, because we have seen that since 1948, in fact. So it's not just the policy of different governments, it's a matter of culture. It has you have exactly as you see with the Americans. When you talk about Republicans, Democrats, and all this, they might have some differences, but when it comes to foreign policy, this is always the same thing. And Trump is no different from its predecessors as we see today. And that's something similar in Israel. And the common point between the two, in fact, is this sense of superiority for different reasons, for different cultural background. But there's a sense of superiority, a sense that somehow this people has to rule the region, its environment, and others have to comply with what they say. And it's very true. The Americans, it's a global power. Therefore, they use this kind of, let's say, behavior globally. Israel is not a global power; it's a regional power, but it's the same behavior regionally. That's why when it has a problem with Lebanon, it doesn't talk to Lebanon; it just strikes Lebanon. It has a problem with Syria; it doesn't talk to Syria; it just bombs them. Exactly the same with Iran and things like that. And in addition to that, Iran has a specificity because, as you probably noted, Iran is not adjacent to Israel. There is no, in fact, if you look at history, if you look at the development of the last century or so, you will see that Iran has absolutely no contentious with no contentious issues with Israel. I mean, they have no border issues, they have no minority issues, they have nothing. In reality, it's just Israel that defines Iran as its enemy. And Iran has enough with the US as enemy. They don't need additional enemies, you know. And up to recently, they had even the Sunni community as enemy, especially after the 1980s, when the Gulf Cooperation Council was created in order to counter the so-called Iranian threat of Ayatollah Khomeini and all that. So you had then a kind of alliance that's the purpose of the Gulf Cooperation Council, by the way, to have this kind of alliance against Iran. So Iran has enough enemy just because it has changed its governance in the late 70s that attracted all these enemies that it has still today. Although with the Sunni community, I mean the Gulf community, we have seen last year that this it seems to be a softening of the Sunni position, and you have seen a rapprochement. But nevertheless, Iran has enough enemy. They don't need to add Israel, where they have absolutely no. There is absolutely, if you look from an Iranian point of view, there's absolutely no reason to have Israel as an enemy. Israel has a reason to have Iran as an enemy, not because they have a problem with Iran, but because Iran is the best enemy of the US. And Iran is, and that's exactly probably what prompted this willingness of Netanyahu to have a war, because it has still this idea that if it can trigger a conflict with Iran, that would prompt the US to jump in and to be present in the region. And this is a constant policy of Israel since the 1950s, to have the US involved, I mean, physically involved in the Middle East. And that started with the Lavon affair that I have mentioned a couple of times, I think, on your channel, which was essentially a terrorist campaign organized by Israel against the British and the Americans in the early 50s in Egypt, in order to provoke the intervention of the US in the region. And that became known as the Lavon affair. You can read that. You have many books that have been written on this affair. And that was the purpose. I mean, Israel was even ready to attack its potential allies in order to provoke an intervention of them in the region. That's something that Israel has always wanted, and that's the reason why they always wanted to expand the conflict, or to escalate the conflicts up to the point that the US would be physically and permanently, I would say, involved in the region. And we have here exactly the same thing. And that's, by the way, if you read the media in the US today, everybody questions, should the US be involved in the region? Because at the end of the day, that's exactly why Israel needs Iran as an enemy. You know, and so Iran has no reason to have Israel as an enemy, and in essence has not. But Israel needs Iran as an enemy in order to have this U.S. intervention in the region.
This is the first time, Colonel, that a country is attacking Israel the way that we're witnessing right now. Just the scenes that we are witnessing in Israel is somehow like the scenes in Gaza with the buildings. And don't you think that would change the mindset of these people who are supporting Netanyahu and his administration? Is that going to change the mindset of those Israelis who were supporting these sort of aggressive policies for many years? And that caused the situation of Gaza, that caused the situation with Lebanon, with Yemen, even with Syria. They're with the government in Syria, they're trying to communicate at the same time they're attacking Syria. It shows that the policy on the part of Israel is just attacking and make them as weak as possible. And how do you see this conflict between Iran and Israel influencing the Israeli society? Is that possible?
Well, there is something odd. I mean, let me just show here. Unfortunately, some is in French because I was not planned to show it. But it's probably interesting to consider that up to now, war for the Israeli society, war in Gaza, for instance, was nothing that something, an entertainment, if you want. And they spent some time looking at the bombing of Gaza, drinking wine and champagne each time you had a bomb coming into Gaza. So this was basically a spectacle, something to look at. It was something that happened outside of the society, if you want. Now they feel the heat, if you want. And if I would take exactly what Zelensky said about the Russians, I would say now the Israeli can feel the war. So far, it was just an entertainment. And all the demonstrations we had against Netanyahu recently was not because of the policy against Gaza. It was simply because Netanyahu had not been able to return the so-called hostages. So it's not because they were unpleased with the Israeli policy. It was a demonstration because the inability of Israel to, or the government to fulfill its promise to return those hostages. Today, we have something different. Now, people understand what war means. Probably they will start, and I say they will start, they will not understand, they will start understanding what it is to be bombed by others. So far, they have never suffered war. The Israelis have not suffered war. They made others suffer war. And today they start suffering war. And that may be a radical change. It's not a country that is used to war. It's a country that is used to making war, not a country that is used to war. Palestinians are used to war. If you bomb them, if you bomb the Palestinians with one bomb, or two bombs, or 10 bombs, it will not change things. You just increase the determination because they are used to that. They lived under bombs. They are used to it. Israeli are not. Now they are surprised. It's a change in their way of life, you know? And that might lead to a regime change in Israel. That might. Although the problem is in Israel that, as in many countries, the regime change might not end up with a more soft government, but on the contrary, that could only promote people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich and this kind of people. That's the problem. We are going toward radicalization because this is a country that has a kind of messianic culture. Everything that you see in Israel is based on Bible. In fact, it's not, and it's not the best interpretation of Bible, if I can put it that way. Um, some say, I mean, I'm not a theologist, and I'm probably not the best person to talk about theology. But when we talk about the Bible, some people, especially in the Christian world, say that there are two gods in the Bible. There is the God before in the Old Testament, which is a God of wrath and revenge, an extremely tough God. And there's the other God, which is in the New Testament, in fact, the Testament of the Christians, which is a God of good and good intention and good faith and all that. So there are two different God has changed its nature from the Old to the New Testament. Now, Christians, as the name says, are bound to this new God, which is a good of good faith and all that. Israelis, in fact, by history, are bound to this old God, which is a God of wrath, revenge, and all. It's exactly what we have seen. Amalek, this rising lion. I mean, the names of these operations refer to this God there from the Old Testament. And it's very unique. I think I see no other government that is so driven by something so messianic. I mean, if you look at, and I lived in Islamic countries, they are not bound by all these ideas of revenge and all that. This is something which is more, and I would even say that is part of the resilience of this population. They probably promote this idea of fatalism. They promote fatalism and things like this more than this idea of revenging, of fighting all the time and all that. And when I see the way the Iranian government reacts to those various crises that we have seen, I have exactly the same feeling that faith is not used as a pretext for war, but it's a pretext for having kind of a behavior, a rule for behavior. That's my interpretation. And therefore, we see a very different approach. And this translates into the command and control that we have seen in the various, especially True Promise 1, 2, 3, that you have a carefully decided and planned operations, not something emotionally driven, not driven by instinct, driven by reason. Where you plan carefully, you study how your enemy stroke, and you develop an adequate response. Not too much, not too less. The problem is with Israel that what is too much and what is too less, because it has the same drawback as the rest of the Western world. It is driven by arrogance, meaning that if they are not completely destroyed, they will never consider that they are destroyed. They will always see a reason for resuming a war, because they are the holders of the truth. And you have seen, again, we're talking about two different conflicts, but there are some similarities. Remember a few weeks ago when Zelensky said in Ukraine that he would not negotiate with Russians. And he refused to have any kind of negotiation unless it's a ceasefire, a 30-day ceasefire. Putin said no. And when asked about the possible solution, Putin said, well, we'll have to finish them off. Because that's exactly the problem. If people are not mature enough to understand that they are in a critical situation, and that's in that situation, probably talking is better than continuing the war. Then, if you don't have that, and if people are ready to fight up to the last, then it's better to destroy them completely. And that's probably what the Iranians will understand about Israel. And that's why I have said Israel should be very careful, because that could be the whole crisis that we have seen developing since October 2023. It could be the sign of the end of Israel, because instead of realizing that there is a point where probably fighting will lead nowhere, and therefore we have to start a new process based on talking to each other and finding, not fighting, but finding a way to live together, which should be based on all the failures and the everything, that the defeats, I could say, that Israel has experienced in Gaza. They should have come to the conclusion that probably it's better to find another way, rather than double down and triple down on the same problem. So, and that is the same with Iran. Therefore, if you know that your enemy is not ready in any way to engage into some kind of dialogue, then you know that if you stop now, that will resume, that will come back and even stronger. So it's better to finish them off now. This is we are talking about strategy here, not about intent. And my personal view, even if probably if I were Iranian, I would come to the same conclusion. The problem here is that when you have no other way than just fighting, then fight. And if I'm the stronger, then I will be the strongest, period. And too bad for Israel. I mean, at the end of the day, they started. So there is a point where the West, and it's interesting, by the way, to see that Western countries, again, this is the same remark I made for Ukraine. When you are involved in a conflict, if you're Israeli, you fight as an Israeli. If you're Iranian, you fight as an Iranian, or Palestinian as a Palestinian. And that's normal. But when you're outside of the conflict, when you're far away, when you have the luxury of not being directly involved in a conflict, why don't you use that luxury in order to promote dialogue? And we see nothing of this in the West. On the contrary, I mean, UK in the past year, but this is also linked to the fact that these countries are not, they have a bad governance, domestic governance. They've had bad policies. Their economy is failing. Everything is failing in their countries. So they try to find any kind of success in foreign policy or engaging wars in Ukraine, in Iran, or wherever. And that's a drama today, because if you had healthy countries in the West, they would say, guys, okay, you had your missile exchange, fine, now let's talk. And we, instead of spending money to provide new weapons and missile or whatever, or shoot, have backfiring sanctions on whoever, let's spend some money for a nice hotel somewhere in Jeddah, and let's talk together. Let's sit at the same table. That should be the role of the Western countries. But apparently, this is absolutely not on the table. There are some, if we look at what's happening in the US at the moment, there are some interrogation. People are questioning the need for being involved with Israel. Everybody understood that Israel started this a process of missile strikes and things like this. In the middle of the negotiation process, in the middle of the negotiation process. And if you read my book on the flood of Al-Aqsa, Al-Aqsa flood, the book that is just behind me, just there, just there. If you read that book, I explain that on several occasions, I mean, on most occasions, in fact, Israel interrupted a negotiation process by killing individuals, Palestinian individuals, not just Hamas. So each time you had a negotiation process, it was interrupted by the Israelis with the killing of some negotiator and things like this. You had exactly the same thing in 2024, with the killing of all the negotiators. And you had this also in Qatar, or in Doha, the elimination. I mean, no, he was killed in he was killed in Tehran. That was the start of the one of the True Promise operation. But he was killed in Tehran in April.
Ismail Haniyeh. You're talking about Ismail.
Ismail Haniyeh. He was a negotiator. So you had a negotiation process, and Israel systematically short-circuited the negotiation process by killing the negotiators, systematically. So we are here exactly in the same situation, that you had the sixth round of negotiation that should have happened in Oman yesterday on the 15th of June. But 2 days before, Israel launched its strikes against Tehran, meaning that they are not negotiating in good faith. Neither the Americans, by the way, because apparently the Americans were aware of that, and Donald Trump was aware of that, and in fact used even the negotiation as a way to lure the Iranian into a false sense of security, if you want. I'm not sure. The Iranians were ready to some extent, but probably at a certain level, they didn't expect to have an attack at this particular moment. And that was what is, in fact, this kind of duplicity by Donald Trump and Israel are extremely disturbing. By the way, the fact that you lure your counterpart into a trap, basically, you say, "Oh, we will talk together," and instead of talking, you just attack him. This has a name in international law. This is perfidy, and perfidy is a war crime. I don't know if I have here, and it's probably a good idea to show that. If I have it here, sorry for the delay, I think. Yes, this is that. I have it. Perfidy. This is in the context of war. Perfidy is a form of deceptive tactic where one side pretends to act in good faith, such as signaling a truce, but does so with the deliberate intention of breaking that promise. So we are exactly that. And it is a war crime. This is exactly what Donald Trump did. And probably Netanyahu. But Netanyahu was not directly part of negotiation, apparently. It was a negotiation about the nuclear program, the Iranian nuclear program. It was between the US and Iran. But Trump knew that. So, in fact, Trump performed the crime of perfidy. And it's a war crime. No question about this. And I think this is well documented. And in fact, he even said it. He even confessed that he was aware of the attack, despite the fact that he knew that the US was involved in this negotiation process. So, and that shows exactly what I've said before. This is, how can you trust the West when they are not even able to comply with the rules they have defined themselves? I mean, all these rules, all these laws of war, and the international humanitarian law, and all that, in fact, derives from the experience of World War II. That's, I mean, obviously you had law of war before that in The Hague in 1907 and all that. I mean, you had precursors, but the the real development, especially when it comes to how you deal with war as a phenomenon, and how you deal with war in regards to civilians and all that has come especially after 1945. And this was an initiative of the West in order to avoid coming back to the situation that we knew in 1939 and all that. So we didn't want this to happen again, and therefore we established some rules to sorry sorry I um, we established some rules to regulate, if you want, the international relations, especially in times of crisis, especially in times of war. Now, what we see is that everything that we had in the international law, and the United Nations is one of the expression of this new laws of that international order that has been established after World War II. And now we have seen that UN has been instrumentalized. We have talked about the IAEA, the International Agency for Atomic Energy, where, in fact, provided, I mean, although they are bound to neutrality, impartiality, they, in fact, provided the names of the Iranian scientists to the Israelis and some other Western powers, not just the names, but also the place where they were and all that. Meaning that we have here these institutions born out of this international order that came out in 1945, which has been corrupted by people without integrity, that in fact have created a sense that those international institutions that we used to trust, and I've been in the service of United Nations for several years, both in New York as in the field, and I'm convinced that the UN, in essence, is a good tool. But I also noticed that it's a good tool as long as everybody plays by the rules. If you start to use your own rules and try to instrumentalize these institutions in order to promote national interests, then you're just destroying the international order. And that's exactly where we are today. We are instrumentalizing those tools. We have seen the OCPV, the OPCV, so the Organization Against Chemical Weapons, and for Syria. I mean, we know that there have been the same distortion or dysfunctionment within the institution, especially in 2011, 2012, when you had all these issues with Syria and chemical weapons. Here, the institution didn't work as they should have, because the directors and you know, these ambassadors who rule those institutions are in fact profoundly corrupt. They don't have the integrity that is required by their function. And we have the same thing with the International Atomic Agency. It's exactly the same thing. They have not shown integrity. And that was, by the way, that was declared by the Russian ambassador Nebenzia at the Security Council. I think it was on Friday or Saturday or so. In any case, we see that we cannot trust these institutions. So then who can we trust then? I mean, when United States want to negotiate, you never know if it's a negotiation for good or it's a negotiation just as a cover for some covert operations. When you engage or you try to have kind of arbitration of the international community, and namely the United Nations, you never know if these institutions work for the sake of humanity or international law, or if they work for the sake of Western powers. And that's in fact something that we have seen in the last couple of years now. It goes a little bit beyond the start of the war in Ukraine, by the way. Or let's say, if we take the start of the war in Ukraine in 2014, then probably we are a little bit there. But it started even before. Even what we have seen in the 2000s with this inability to cope with the situation in Iraq, for instance, the inability of the international organization, namely the UN, to identify the real problem there and to prevent this intervention or U.S. intervention in Iraq, that proved to be disastrous. So it shows that this international order that we have established in 1945 has essentially collapsed to some extent. And that's a pity, because I think it was a good initiative of the international community. And it's the spirit of this international order is still supported by the biggest part on this planet, the biggest part of the nations. But my fear is that now those who support this international order are in fact those you find under the expression of rest of the world. The so-called Western world has completely abandoned this idea of international law-based order. By the way, that's the reason why even Switzerland, by the way, before, when you read official papers in Switzerland, they promoted the international law-based order. Today, if you read the recent publication for the security policy of Switzerland, they talk about the international rule-based order. So we are no longer protecting the international law. We are protecting international rules that are defined not by the international community, but the Western community. And I think that's a tragic evolution, because it leads to a situation as the one we have in Palestine, in Iran, in Russia, and probably at one point in China. Because again, if you analyze every of these individual countries, you will see that in each of these conflicts, the international order the international law-based order has not been respected. In every of this conflict, you have a breach of international law. In Ukraine, international law were the Minsk agreements, and they were rejected, flatly rejected by France and Germany. In Palestine, we have hundreds, literally hundreds, of resolutions saying that Israel is violating the international law. But nobody even thought about enforcing that. And with Iran, it's exactly the same thing. I mean, what is at stake is essentially the right of Iran to enrich uranium. And in fact, if you read carefully, if you know the situation, and I'm not even a strong expert on that, but I've studied the whole issue of Iran in my book on governing by fake news. You can see that Iran has faithfully followed the international law, faithfully. And the enrichment of uranium that Trump wants to prohibit in Iran is, in fact, according to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been signed by Iran, which is, by the way, also in the JCPOA, so the Joint Comprehensive Peace Program of Action, that has been abandoned by the US by Trump in 2018. In those documents, you have the inalienable right of every country to process uranium, inalienable, meaning that it's a fundamental right for every nation to have or to use nuclear power for peaceful purposes. And so far, we know, because this has been stated in a national intelligence estimate of November 27, 2007, by it was written then by the CIA. And at that time, they said that they had, with high confidence, and probably I have even here the extract, and that's probably interesting for the audience to remember that, to have the exact wording, and that's it. That was the national intelligence estimate that said, we judge with high confidence that in the fall of 2003, Tehran halted its nuclear weapons program. And that was, in fact, repeated in March this year by Tulsi Gabbard. And that was, in fact, Tulsi Gabbard was simply, this is in French. Sorry for that. I have probably the English version somewhere. Sorry about that. Here it is. Sorry, here we go. In March 2025, the Office of National Intelligence, representing the US intelligence community, said, we continue to assess Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and that Khamenei has not reauthorized the nuclear weapon program he suspended in 2003 through pressure, though pressure has probably built on him to do so. So we know that the Iranians have a peaceful program. Therefore, it's entitled for this inalienable right to enrich uranium. So why won't the US prohibit that? And that's where we fall from the international law to the rule-based order. This is not the international law. This is just the rules defined and decided by the US. And that's exactly what cannot work. The international community cannot be based on discretionary decisions made by individual states. Because at one point, if Switzerland becomes the most powerful country in the world, Switzerland is probably not the worst example because it has democracy. But that means that if we admit this very improbable situation, that Switzerland becomes the most powerful country in the world, it can impose its own rule to the rest of the world. This is simply not acceptable. Even if Switzerland could probably be considered as a democratic country, Although, to be honest, today I, I raise a lot of doubts about this, the evolution, but it's another discussion. In any case, we see that it cannot be one country that decide for all the others. And that's why we have this international law based order. This is precisely to have something that belongs to everybody and is not the prerogative of one actor. The problem is that now we tend to be more and more focused on the the power of individual countries. That's the reason why, if I were Chinese, and we see when I see everything that is developing, again, we are, it's not the topic of today, but everything that is developing in terms of trade wars and things like this, the Chinese may have exactly the same conclusion as I established before. That if you want to have peace at one point, you have just to destroy completely the US economy and to make them rebuild that in conformity with international law. Because now they are too powerful to rule, to do things. I mean, there is a sense of impunity, a sense of invulnerability that creates precisely this sense of dominance. Now, to destroy this sense of dominance, you probably have to destroy the whole US economy. And that's exactly what I said when about Ukraine, when the Russians say, well, if they want they don't want to talk, then we have to finish them off. And probably, if you look at Israel, as seen from Iran, you may probably come to the same conclusion. Because there is no alternative, because these countries don't want to talk. They feel superior to others. And therefore, for them, there is no rationale for engaging into a dialogue. So it's a very sad perspective, to be honest. But I think we have to consider this evolution. I'm not advocating this solution, but I'm just saying that's probably the direction where we are heading to.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Carl, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.